Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 41 in the ongoing series. In this episode we look at the kind of game-changing interview that was the interview with Barbara Walters it aired on the 17th of March 2000. Quite a few things came out of the interview besides the content of the interview itself, besides the inconsistencies of the interview itself. There are quite a few very interesting things that came out of this interview, and there was sort of a follow-on to the interview when the Ramseys went on to Larry King. Larry King kind of took his cue from Barbara Walters, and in a very, very interesting area, which we're going to go to in a second. There was also a very interesting reaction from the governor at the time, Bill Owens, who was the governor of Colorado, and we're going to look at his response to this. What I want you to do is to think about what we're talking about. I've already put the full transcript of the interview on Patreon. I want you to think for yourself whether you think the questions Barbara Walters asked were appropriate, and whether the answers were appropriate, and whether the entire interview as a whole was appropriate in your mind, whether it was fair or whether it wasn't fair. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If you do share, please use the hashtag TCRS. And let's get started.
Do you understand why it is that so many people still think you are guilty?
I understand that they've been told that by the media for 3 long years. I'm amazed that the whole world doesn't think we're guilty.
So that is an excerpt from the interview, and we're going to analyze some of it. There certainly isn't scope to analyze all of it, but what I want to impress upon you guys is the fact that the interview was actually conducted before the book was released. In fact, the interview seemed to have taken place around the end of February, right? Now, the question that I have, I'm not sure what the answer is, but the question is, did Barbara Walters actually read the book that the Ramseys wrote? Did she read the book and then conduct her interview based on not only reading their book but also her knowledge of the case, based on news reports, based on talking to people? Did she educate herself and then go through the book and sort of check what was going on? And bear in mind, the book by Steve Thomas was going to come out about a month later. So Steve Thomas's book came out April 2000, and the Ramseys book came out March 2000. Barbara Walters actually conducted this interview in February, and it just would be interesting to know, did the Ramseys give her an advance copy? I don't get that impression. I don't get that impression from how she conducts the interview. I don't get the impression from the questions that she asks them. At no point does she refer to the book. On page XYZ, you said ABC. And that would be a good way of going about an interview on specific questions, specific issues. There's an interesting article in the New York Post which was published long before the episode aired, around about 3 weeks. And what is interesting about this article is it sets up the mindset for the audience, saying that it was a no-holds-barred interview. It describes withering questions from Barbara Walters. And in the very first paragraph, it describes she describes the Ramseys as quote unquote very believable, and she finds them very credible, this veteran newswoman, right? She also says that the couple, meaning the Ramseys, quote unquote, did not seem rehearsed. What they were saying didn't seem rehearsed. And she also said that they were, quote, not the least bit evasive, end quote. So this is quite interesting, the way that the narrative was framed even before people got to watch it. So even before people got to see this, they're told nothing's rehearsed, it's not evasive, they're very believable. And then people watched it. And we know that the governor was appalled by what he saw. But before we get to his response, let's go into the interview firsthand and see what we think about it.
Do you understand why it is that so many people still think you are guilty?
I understand that they've been told that by the media for 3 long years. I'm amazed that the whole world doesn't think we're guilty.
So I've played that particular clip for the second time because I really think it needs to be emphasized. I think it is very interesting that Barbara Walters says she says more than I think she intends to say there, which is that people in general, there's almost the implication there in that statement that most people, that the majority of people, that the majority of Americans at that point, 3 years after the fact, believed that the Ramseys were guilty. Now, let's be practical here and say at this point the public were misled to believe that the grand jury didn't vote to indict and that there really wasn't enough evidence and all that kind of thing. And so there was this impression that of there not being closure, right? And what is very interesting is, obviously we know that the grand jury did vote to indict, even though America at that point didn't know that. And if you take that, the fact that the grand jury voted to indict at the time, and the the public, society in general, appeared to believe that the Ramseys were guilty. Now, you might argue with that. You might say, no, I don't think so. I think most people thought the Ramseys were innocent. You could also say that today most people think the Ramseys are innocent. And maybe you're right. The only way to know is to conduct a poll. But the fact is, Barbara Walters opens her questioning by saying that, a lot of people think you are guilty.
Do you understand why it is that so many people still think you are guilty?
It's quite a good question, and it's quite interesting how long John takes to answer that question. And, if you had to ask that question to yourself, do you understand why people thought the Ramseys were guilty or innocent? It's quite an interesting question to reflect upon. And what is interesting with John Ramsey's answers, first of all, I think you could acknowledge that Barbara Walters is saying something that makes sense. In other words, John does understand. He does understand that a lot of people think that they are guilty, right? I think you must also compare it to the Madeleine McCann case, where the McCanns would actually make the claim that most people thought they were innocent. And I'm not sure if that was the case when they were making some of those claims. I'm talking about I think it was June, July 2007. It's a separate argument, but it is quite an interesting one, which it's all about, consensus. Do most of society believe something or do they not? And bear in mind what this is all about. The Ramseys are doing this interview to promote a book which is all about their innocence. So all of this is about defending their standing in society, personally defending themselves, giving an account of themselves, right? And all of that is fine, but when you look at it in the context of, well, were they doing the same? Were they going through the same effort? Think about how much effort it takes to write a book, how much time it takes to write a book. And then think about, and also, they didn't just do one interview here with Barbara Walters. In fact, this interview with Barbara Walters apparently took 2 hours. They also followed that up with kind of a press tour. They went on to Larry King several times, and we're going to get to that in episodes following this. But the point is that compare their interest in being in the media to how much time did they spend with the police. And that is a major issue that came up during this interview, was did they cooperate? Were they cooperating at this time? 3 years after the incident, bear in mind it was still at that time an unsolved case. It still is an unsolved case almost 25 years later. Were the Ramseys cooperating with the police then? Simple question. The other thing that I think is very interesting is that John Ramsey kind of blames fake news in his answer. He basically says, oh, I'm not surprised people believe what they do. It's what the reporters have been saying. So let's recap what we're talking about. The grand jury voted to indict. So were they wrong? Boulder police had their suspicions. Were they wrong as well? That's now 2. And then the media were reporting things in a certain way besides Barbara Walters and besides what the New York Post said about Barbara Walters. So there were some exceptions. And there are a lot of documentaries that have come out recently, especially from A&E, and recently ABC did the documentary The List, which presents the Ramseys as innocent, right? But if you take the media narrative as it stood in 2000, the grand jury indictments that were voted on but not kind of authorized, that followed a 13-month investigation, and you take the Boulder police position, were all three of those entities incorrect?
I understand that they've been told that by the media for 3 long years. I'm amazed that the whole world doesn't think we're guilty.
Do you believe that? Do you believe that John Ramsey truly believes that, is amazed that the world doesn't think that they're guilty? Do you think he really believes that? The other thing is, we know that the Ramseys hired a public relations team, a PR spokesman. They started a website. They were very much involved in putting things in the media, into, for example, the parts of the ransom note. And while following the other thing I think to emphasize once again is the Ramseys went onto CNN very early on. So, to say that the media had this particular position against them, well, they went onto the media, or into the media at least on 2 occasions where they could say their own thing. And this was, you could argue, the 3rd occasion. And then the question is, during each interview, so the first one on CNN on the 1st of January, the next one in very early May 1997, immediately following the police statements, and then this one, you could say for all 3 of those, did the Ramseys pass the credibility test? Did the public believe them? Did you believe them? Right? So in other words, where they are creating the media, where they are influencing the media, and make no mistake, this interview on Barbara Walters was meant to influence the media narrative. It was meant to say, hey guys, this is our story, believe us and go and buy our book. And again, bear in mind, this book was to come out a month ahead of Steve Thomas's book. The other thing that I don't think you can kind of get away from is the media are often caught in a tug of war in true crime, in terms of if the media ingratiate themselves with a suspect, as they sort of did with Chris Watts during the Sermon on the Porch. In other words, you either give the suspect the benefit of the doubt or pretend to give him the benefit of the doubt, then he is likely to be more forthcoming, more cooperative, is likely to say more. It's the same technique used in interrogations, right? So if you want to get the story, then you pretend that you believe somebody or you don't give them a hard time. And now the question is with Barbara Walters, was she giving them a hard time? Was she doing her job, or was she pretending to give them a hard time? And that's something that I want you guys to think about. Because the opposite way of treating a suspect is to be completely forthright, to say, I think you're guilty, something like that. And then to aggressively counter every statement they make with something that is fact-based or anchored in some sort of narrative that is to some extent provable or demonstrable. In other words, you give them a very hard time. How long do you think they're going to sit there? In other words, the Ramsey spoke to Barbara Walters for 2 hours, but if she'd taken a much stronger tone, how long do you think they would have wanted to sit and talk to her? So you have this thing in true crime where, certainly in terms of the media, and there's actually a incentive to some extent give suspects the benefit of the doubt so you can get material. This is when conducting interviews with them, right? I think it's a little bit different when you are writing or reporting in a different way, in other words, not directly, and also when that person has already snubbed you and said, okay, I see what position you're taking, so I'm not going to associate myself with you at all. And we've seen politicians do that sort of thing. You realize that a particular network isn't on your side, and so you snub them, right? I do think it's fair to say that the media narrative has shifted from being somewhat against the Ramseys, if that's the way to put it, initially, to being, in terms of the mainstream narrative, cheerleaders of the Ramsey-inspired or the Ramsey defense, which is the intruder theory. And Barbara Walters also goes into that to quite a large extent, which I'm sure delighted the Ramseys, and spoke about Lou Smith and what a great detective he was. But let's listen into some more from the interview.
Based on what they've been told.
Let me go through some of the major reasons why people feel you were guilty. The beauty pageants. If we had only seen pictures of John Bonet in little jeans and a T-shirt, there might not have been the same feeling. But what we saw in still photographs and in videos was a child dressed like an adult, very suggestive in many of these pictures, lipstick, mascara, moving around on the stage on these beauty pageants. To many people, this looks perverted. Therefore, there's got to be something wrong here.
There is something wrong here if someone thinks that looks perverted. Jean Monnet was an entertainer. She would entertain at the drop of a hat.
So again, this is quite an interesting question, but it's also something that I think is misunderstood with the Ramsey case. So I kind of see where Barbara Walters is going, and it's something that comes up quite often in the media, is that it's this idea that by sexualizing John Bonet, and Barbara Walters uses certain quite interesting terms, that this is going to, quote unquote, attract some kind of child predator, right? And what I think is not spoken about is the idea that by sexualizing John Bonet, what impact is that going to have on her peers, on other children? How are they going to respond? And what I think is very interesting is the attitudes to the pageant circuit of the Ramsey friends and their children. And we know that there was one particular child who also wanted to follow in, who wanted to do the same thing as John Bonet. But when she found out that she was going to have to perform in front of a stage, so she liked the outfit, she liked the some aspects of it, but the fact that she would now have to spend time rehearsing and then perform in front of a lot of people, that put her off. But what is very interesting is, remember, Patsy came from, she was a Southerner, and the Southerner have a certain interest in extravagance and performing and, being the center of attention and lavishing in that attention, luxuriating in the attention. I think the Boulder community and people in Colorado had a slightly different view towards certain things like that. I think they were more interested in camping and skiing and nature and the outdoors than in sort of meretricious things. Not completely, of course, but just that they were more, I think the Coloradoans are perhaps more sporty, whereas Southerners might be more aware of their appearances and their standing in society. And I know that's a big generalization to make, but I'm making it in terms of what we know about this case. And you can decide, is it true or not, and what bearing does it possibly have on the case. The other thing I think you can't get away from is what happens when one member of the family is sexualized. And in terms of what's the response to another member of the family. And so you could say, in a very basic way, the response might be something like envy or jealousy or anger. And I think there could even be the possibility of an attraction, that you think, wow, she does look beautiful, or something like that. Now, I can tell you that there's a case in South Africa where you actually had a young boy, I think he was 15 years old or 16 years old, and his sister wasn't in pageants, but she was the star of the family. She was very well loved by her peers. She was a pretty young lady. I think she was 13 or 14, about 2 years younger than her brother. She was a good performer in terms of her academics and I think her sport and so on. So she was a success story at school, whereas her brother was like a loser and struggling and not getting good grades and socially at school not succeeding. And he was at a boys' school, and I guess he was a little bit of a small boy compared to his classmates, and for whatever reason he was not making it in terms of his peers, whereas his sister was, and his sister was very popular. There's a lot more to say about that case, and if there are possibly analogies, but I'm not going to go into it any further. What I do think is worth concentrating on, just in a conceptual sense, is the notion of a sexualized child, and a child who was ultimately in a situation where she died within the context of what appeared to be some kind of sexual game. There was a heart written on her hand. She was tied up in a strange way, using a strange contraption, which you could either call a toggle rope or a garrote, depending on which side of the fence you're standing on. Interestingly, in the Barbara Walters interview, the word garrote is used over and over and over again, which does impute this predator. And John Ramsey actually provides a profile of this sexual predator. And it's quite a departure from the original standing that he had in May 1997, where he said that he was appalled at the idea that something like that could have happened to John Bonet. And now the profile is quite explicit, isn't it?
A dress up.
You yourself had entered beauty contests.
Yes.
I'm a junior at West Virginia University.
So this was, what, fun for you both
It
to
was
have
the
her do
most
this?
wonderful time of my life. It's not unlike a father who enjoyed playing baseball as a child. He wants to impart that same love of the game with his son or daughter. There's just absolutely nothing wrong with it.
They called John Bonet a 6-year-old Lolita, a punt-sized sex kitten.
The people that look at these things and see something perverted, that didn't come from JonBenet. That's coming from the viewer, not.
So I think Patsy's got a point there, that this whole thing that it's perverted and whatever is coming from the viewer. I tend to agree with that, except if you look at both the JonBenet Ramsey case and the Madeleine McCann case, who is responsible for these paedophile abductor narratives? Where does it come from? Whose idea was it? And now you've just had another case in Malaysia where a French-Irish couple, I've actually written a book about it called Not All Who Wander Are Lost, but where they once again, it's a question of, was there neglect from the parents, or was there some kind of sexual predator, paedophile predator, but with absolutely no evidence? And so you've got to ask, here you have Patsy saying, oh, no, it's the audience who are thinking this, right? But let's be fair, where's this thought actually coming from? And John Ramsey, in this interview, presents the media with his profile of who the sexual predator is, or what the predator is, or what kind of person we're talking about. And let's be honest, in 2021, what is either the mainstream view of what actually happened to JonBenet? And I don't know whether to say, when you say mainstream, does that mean the public at large, or what the media is saying? Because it seems to me that might be different. Or you could also say what the media are allowed to say, I guess. But the issue is, where did this narrative actually come from? Who started it? And what do you think the answer is to that question?
So let me go through what the motives are. Motive number 1. You are guilty, Mr. Ramsey, because there was some evidence that your daughter had been sexually molested.
I know, as best I can know, as a father who was with his daughter every day that I was home, she was not sexually abused or molested before December 26th.
Okay.
So right at the end of that statement, if you're watching the video, John Ramsey licks his lips. Not that that necessarily means one thing or the other. But what is interesting is what John Ramsey says about that he was there with JonBenet every day. If you've been following this series from the beginning, you know that there's been this, in fact, in the very first episode, the gardener or the landscaper said that JonBenet was crying because she was missing her father. And there was this sense, even from one of the housekeepers, that John Ramsey was often away from home. I'm not sure if he was away on weekends or if he was away during the week and only at home on weekends, but the fact is that he was a busy businessman. He had a lot going on at the time. There were a lot of events going on, and the impression that one gets from the archive is that, unlike what John Ramsey is saying here, of course what he's saying here is a little bit slippery, because he says, when I was home, I was with her. But it's kind of creating the impression that he was home a lot. And I think a more complete answer would be to say that, he wasn't home all of that much. And it's quite an interesting question from Barbara Walters saying, that your motive is that you molested your daughter. And John's response is, well, I was with her a lot, or I was with her all the time. It's not quite what he's saying. He's sort of saying that, when he was home, he was with her. But it's not really answering the question. I think a proper answer would be, well, I didn't molest my daughter. And also there's no chance that she was molested. He sort of does say that. He says that it seems that he's saying that he provided good care, protection, and custody of JonBenet. She wasn't neglected. He's not saying this directly, but indirectly. And as a result, there was no chance that she could have come to harm in that sense. But I think a counter to that is, the counter, which is, was John Ramsey around a lot? And if not, was there then the opportunity for somebody close to John Bonet to cause harm to her in that sense? The other thing I think we've got to think about is the idea and the claim and the potential evidence that was John Bonet molested prior to the day that she died and the day that this incident occurred and the activities that happened on that night. And I think if you say that she was, that creates a very difficult thing to defend. It creates a very difficult scenario, and there is argument around this. So what is very interesting with Barbara Walters, we'll get to that in a second, is she makes this accusation, John answers it, and he sort of denies that there was any prior sexual interference. And there's some argument whether that's true or not. It depends on, I guess, which sources you go to. But what is very interesting is then Barbara Walters, after asking this apparently tough question, then is right back into their corner and says, by the way, I spoke to Dr. Both, or that John Bonet's pediatrician has confirmed that there was no prior sexual interference or sexual abuse, ultimately sort of validating that position. Let's listen in.
Mr. Ramsey, because there was some evidence that your daughter had been sexually molested.
I know, as best I can know, as a father who was with his daughter every day that I was home, she was not sexually abused or molested before December 26th.
Okay, but on December 26th, there are some indications that your daughter was sexually molested.
Well,
therefore, here's the motive. You were doing it. Maybe you'd done it before. Maybe you just did it that night. Perhaps your wife discovered you. Whatever it was, John Bonet cried out. You killed her.
Well, that's fits right in the category of it could have been done by an alien as well. It makes no sense. There is no history. A person doesn't go throughout their lives as a normal human being, one night turn into a monster, slaughter their daughter, go to bed, and get up and act normal from there on. That doesn't happen. In these kinds of cases, virtually all of them, I suspect, where there is child abuse in a family, there's a long history. And that's not the case in our family.
I have to point out that John Bonet's pediatrician, who had been her pediatrician from birth, has publicly said that he never saw any evidence of sexual molestation. There never have been reports from her school, and yet there is the suspicion.
I would have given my life for John Bonet in an instant, and was sorry that I couldn't have done it that night. To be accused of harming my child in any way is beyond comprehension.
So John Ramsey talks about being accused of harming his child is beyond comprehension, but it's not really, because that is what happened. I'm not saying that he harmed John Bonet in that direct sense. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that John Bonet did come to harm. The other thing is, we do know about her history of going to the doctor as many times as she did. We also know that there was the bedwetting that was not, it wasn't something that was, how can I put it, it wasn't a small issue. It was something that was happening a lot, and it was happening with both children. And this is the next question that Barbara Walters asks Patsy, but it's not really asked in the sense of a medical, in a medical sense, to say, well, what about the bedwetting and what could be behind that, and how much was it going on, and were you aware of that? Do you see what I'm getting at? And because you could have bedwetting and and sexual interference going hand in hand, and the inability to sleep and trauma and stress and all that kind of thing.
To be accused of harming my child in any way is beyond comprehension.
But that is what the grand jury accused not only John but Patsy of doing as well. And I don't think it is a direct thing. I don't think it is you physically hurt JonBenet or did anything else. It's harm from the other end of the spectrum, which is from not being around enough, I imagine. It's from neglect. It's from failure to protect someone. And John makes an excellent point where he says, in his own defense, where he says, usually in these cases you have a precedent. You have behavior that happens in the past repeatedly over and over again, and it escalates. And so these events don't just happen out of the blue. And he's absolutely right in terms of exonerating himself to say, well, there's he doesn't say it explicitly, but there's no evidence of him doing any of that in his backstory, right? Now, of course, if you want to go into that area, you can talk about John having an affair on his first wife. And, in the Chris Watts case, Chris Watts was also having an affair. I know there's an author who's working on a story that Chris Watts abused his children in that sense, which I don't believe for a second. But you could certainly see where if you go into the area of someone who's having an affair on his wife doesn't have that kind of family value to the extent, in terms of you love your child so much that you wouldn't have an affair, or to the extent that you're going to be there. Bear in mind, if you're having an affair, you're not home. You've got to not be home. You've got to be doing things in secret. Your attention is distracted from the care, protection, and custody of your children. So it is not so much the harm in terms of directly, it's the harm in terms of not being there. It's the harm in terms of the neglect side of things. And so when John Ramsey talks about this idea of harming JonBenet being incomprehensible, it wasn't incomprehensible to the grand jury, because the grand jury voted to indict on exactly those charges: child abuse and neglect. And what is very interesting is when John was asked about these charges on a CNN interview, I think it was in 2016, but we'll get to that later on. I'm not going to take this any further for those on YouTube. We'll continue with this interview. It's quite a fascinating interview in more detail on Patreon. So if you want to follow the rest of it, if you want to read the full transcript, head on to patreon.com/TCRS. And I'll see you guys next time.
Yet some of the authorities have said that you staged this.